Welcome to the first International Conference on Educational Theory and Research 2016.
So first and foremost, we want to thank our sponsors, Pearson, Gordian Academy, Nuance Publishing, Izmir Chamber of Commerce, and Balchovo Municipality, because without them, this conference wouldn't be possible. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. Okay, and let me introduce to you my colleague here. She's a very talented English language teacher. She works in the Curriculum and Materials Development Unit in the English Prep program. She is a graduate student at University of Massachusetts. She speaks 6 languages. She has won several awards, including Best Teacher in the World. Yes, and even Time Magazine has named her the new face in English teaching. Please say hello to, what's your name again? Yes, Heather Austin.
Thank you. And this is Antonio Ramirez.
What?
Oh, I'm sorry. Of course. No, seriously, he's a fantastic teacher of Spanish here at Izmir Economy. And he also has a master's in computer information systems. He's a member of the tech team here at Ekonomi, and he also recently joined the TDU, which is the Teacher Development Unit. And as you can see, he has a very unique sense of humor. So please welcome with us, we're Antonio Ramirez.
Thank you. Thank you.
We'll be your announcers for the remainder of the conference.
Yes, and let me just say that it's a pleasure to be here among very illustrious professionals. And we want to welcome you to Izmir Economy University here in the beautiful city of Izmir.
Beautiful place. Welcome. Okay, so now without further ado, I'd like to introduce a very important figure here at our university. He is the rector of Izmir University of Economics. Please welcome Professor Dr. Oğuz Esen.
Dear distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you all most warmly. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning for the first international conference on educational theory and research. Today we are here to discuss various aspects of higher education. This is very timely since Higher Education Council YÖK is currently working on a new legislation for higher education. There is a widespread recognition that skills and human capital have become the key to economic prosperity and social well-being. Higher education represents a critical factor in human capital and plays a central role in the success and sustainability of knowledge economy. The labor market continues to become more and more global and competitive. The demand for high skills is growing. Higher education has a central role to play in equipping students with these skills. Dear guests, higher education today is characterized by massive expansion and wider participation, more diverse profiles of higher institutions and their students, more integrated use of communication and educational technology, greater internalization, and more emphasis on quality of teaching, research, and service. Access to higher education has known a spectacular expansion over the 15 years. In 1970, UNESCO estimated that roughly 33 million students were enrolled in higher education worldwide. Global enrollment has doubled since 2000, with today some 200 million students worldwide and estimated 400 million in 2013. Mass higher education has transformed the higher education system worldwide. In the past 30 years, many different kinds of degree-granting institutions have been established to serve diverse populations and purposes. A corollary of the shift from elite to mass higher education access and participation is the growing diversity of students in terms of social economic background, academic ability, expectations, motivation, and engagement. International higher education landscape is also changing. If there are today around 4 million internationally mobile students in the world, estimations indicate that it might grow to 7 million in 2020. But internalization of higher education is no longer just about students leaving their country to study abroad. Universities have adopted broader strategies that go beyond mobility and cover many other types of academic cooperation, such as joint degrees and distance learning programs. The higher education landscape is undergoing significant change as a result of technological innovations. Technology is becoming central to the process of learning and teaching in higher education. Alongside classes taught fully online, technology is also influencing traditional campus-based teaching and learning. Virtual learning environments, flipped classroom, and blended learning have all become an accepted part of classroom over the past years. The Trend 2015 report of the European University Association indicates two developments in higher education are key. First, the focus on learning and teaching has gained momentum and become a priority for institutions, including for the universities that are most research active, and the development of technology-assisted learning has opened up opportunities for different learning experiences. Let me say a few words about the Turkish higher education system. The number of universities has dramatically increased during the last 10 years. Around 100 universities have been established since 2006. As of December 2015, there are 193 universities in the Turkish higher education system. With a dramatic increase in the number of higher education institutions in the last decade, higher education has become more accessible in Turkey. This academic year, there are approximately 6.1 million higher education students in Turkey. Turkey has actively participated in the Bologna process. The Bologna process has been an important opportunity for recognition, quality assurance, and internalization of Turkish higher education. Izmir University of Economics was founded and thus was born into the Bologna process in 2001. As a result, Izmir University of Economics rules and regulations have generally evolved in harmony with Bologna process. It started the restructuring of its system in order to fully implement the Bologna process, as well as the link to course learning outcomes to program qualifications and the national qualification framework and the European qualification framework. Izmir University of Economics is pursued as one of the most successful institutions in the implementation of the Bologna process in Turkey. It was awarded by the European Commission with DS and ICETR labels. Izmir University of Economics was chosen as a pilot for the implementation Turkish national qualification framework alongside with the 3 public universities. Since the quality assurance is a key element of Bologna process, Izmir University of Economics has pursued overall reform of internal quality management serving also this purpose. With the prediction and the vision that the higher education landscape is changing both in Turkey and the world, Izmir University of Economics included promoting innovative use of digital technology in learning and teaching experience of students and progressive curricula demanded by international environment as one of the strategic objectives in its institutional strategic plan. Taking its roots from an international search conference 2 years ago, a new and comprehensive system we call Smart Campus has been adopted as of the 2015 fall semester. Starting in the fall semester, we synchronized the Blackboard LMS with Panopto lecture capture software so that the students who have access to Blackboard would automatically have access to the videos of the lectures. Efforts to continuously improve learning and teaching processes should not be limited to using new technologies. New pedagogies and efficient and innovative use of digital technologies in teaching and learning methods and techniques in our ultimate goal. To this end, 2 new organizations have been formed. The first one, Teaching and Learning Center, which aim to assist faculty in areas such as course design, teaching methods, and use of new technologies and provide support to students. In addition, Technology-Enhanced Learning Coordination Committee has been formed to provide guidance on efficient use of LMS as well as other new technologies. Dear participants, let me finally wish you a successful conference and fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to our rector for that speech. And...
Hold on. All right, I'm on. So, let's take a couple moments to just go over the program for the day very quickly.
Yes. First, in a few minutes, we'll have our first plenary speaker. Okay, and after that, we're going to break for lunch at 12:30.
Okay, and then after lunch, we'll have our concurrent sessions from 1:30 to 2:30 in rooms 313 to 316 in this building on the 3rd floor. After that, we'll have a coffee break at about 2:30, and then we'll hear from our second plenary speaker at 3 o'clock.
Right, and then at 4 o'clock, we're going to have yet another coffee break.
We love coffee.
Yes, and concurrent sessions start at 4:15 to 5:15 in same rooms here in this building on the 3rd floor.
Okay, and then in order to help you process everything that you've done today, from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock, we have a cocktail for you at the Balçova Belediyesi Orman Ucu Cafe. Okay? And there are Ask Me students around the conference area. There are lovely volunteer students. They're wearing white sweatshirts. They say Ask Me. So if you need help getting to the cafe or you need any help getting anywhere in the building, you can always ask them.
Yes, and now let me remind you that the Ephesus excursion has been canceled, but instead of that, we're going to have an Izmir city tour.
It's free.
Yes, it's free. Did you say free?
Free.
We said free, right?
Free.
Right. And so please remember to sign up for that at the registration desk. And we're also going to have a gala dinner tomorrow night, right? Yep. Tomorrow night.
Yep.
But please remember to sign up for that, for the gala dinner, because the sign up ends today at noon.
So don't forget. All right. So as you can see, we have a really enticing schedule for everybody, and it's going to be a really great conference. I mean, the whole theme is transitions in higher education. So I think we're really going places in this field, actually. I mean, technology is becoming a critical part of learning, and evaluation and assessment methods are always developing, and there's even more institutional focus on lifelong learning.
Yes, yes, but.
But, there's always a but.
Yes, but there are people who are wary of these changes. They are kind of traditional, they're very traditional, they're old-fashioned. They don't like where things are going, and they just want things to stay the same.
Yeah, that's true, but that's not what we're about here at this conference. Those people are just on a different road. So I'd like to introduce our first plenary speaker, K Livingston. She's a professor in educational research, policy, and practice at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. And she also works very closely with policymakers, teachers, and key educational stakeholders at international, national, and local levels.
Yes, and she's the editor of the European Journal of Teacher Education, a member of the UK National Commission for UNESCO Scotland Committee. So please welcome to our first plenary speaker, Professor K Livingston.
Hoş geldiniz.
Hoş bulduk.
Good morning, everybody, and I'm very pleased to be here. I was particularly pleased to be invited back to Izmir. I've already been here once, and I think it's always a good sign when you're invited back somewhere. I have to say to you that I feel very at home. As you perhaps know, I come from Scotland, and I live in a very green country, and it's green because it rains all the time. So I feel very at home with the weather this morning. But thank you to the organisers, and I think it is very insightful to be organising a conference like this in the university, and I think it speaks volumes of Izmir Technical University that they've taken the opportunity to have this inaugural conference on theory and educational research. As indicated in the biography from our delightful young hosts, I am the editor of the European Journal of Teacher Education, and perhaps you know that it is a very prestigious journal. It's in the Social Sciences Citation Index, and we receive some 260 papers each year, of which we can only publish 28. And I think it's very interesting to note that over the last 3 years, the most papers submitted out of all of those 260 odd have come from Turkey. And what that tells me is that something is happening in Turkey around perhaps pressures or opportunities to publish the research that you're doing. So I think without a doubt it is a very timely conference. And one of the other things that being the editor of that journal has really given me a fantastic access to is looking at teacher education all around the world, because the papers come not just from the European Union, but literally from across the world. And when one has the opportunity to analyse these papers, you begin to see the patterns that although our organisations are very different, although our structures are very different, then in fact many of the key issues in the change process that are facing universities and higher education around the world are very, very similar. And the rector, I think, very eloquently set out some of the key changes that are affecting all of our lives every day. The topic that I've been asked to present on today is transitions in the professional development of teacher educators in higher education. So I am speaking to those of you in the audience who have responsibility for teaching the teachers who are in our schools. No matter what subject, I'm going to take a very general sweep in thinking about teacher education. It is a topic that is very central to my own research. It's also a very personal story. I am a teacher educator. I have been a teacher educator for a long time now, and so I would like to just share with you some of the transitions that I have been through, and it really sets the scene for the views that I have about coping with change. So this is really a snapshot of my life. I started in teacher education in the late 1980s. I became a teacher educator, and at that time in Scotland we were in colleges of education. So basically you came from the teaching profession and you came into being a teacher educator with, yes, a degree, a bachelor's degree or a degree in your subject, but the expectations, and I choose my words very carefully, the expectations were that we were coming to teach teachers, really to pass on the experience we had. So the notion was that we taught teachers, and as I say, I choose those words carefully and I'll come back to them. I then moved into a university in the middle of the 1990s. There were pressures on all of the colleges of education to close and to become part of higher education. And that was my first transition from being in a college to actually experiencing teacher education. And at that time, I became a director of a research centre. And that was my first transition, that shift from being a teacher, thinking about classrooms, schools, issues to do with schools, to being responsible for research. And most of the research we did was funded research. So I have to say that it was a huge transition from feeling that you were having constant interaction with teachers and thinking about the issues of school to filling in grant applications for research. So a huge change in my life. And then I moved to another university, and this time again, quite a dramatic change, because I wasn't sitting within a faculty of education where all of the colleagues round about me were talking about schools and education, because the School of Education became part of a College of Arts and Social Sciences. So we were working with social scientists, and again, a very different perspective on life. And at that point, I was asked to lead something that was called, for short, STNE, Scottish Teachers for a New Era. And it really was about tearing up the rules of teacher education and saying, you know, what actually should teacher education look like in the 21st century? And so I actually took on dual responsibilities, because on the one hand we were researching what we were doing, we were collecting data throughout that whole period, but at the same time we were changing the teacher education programme fundamentally, and I'll come back to that at the very end to tell you a bit more about that. But again, a big change. I was having to juggle. Am I a teacher? Am I a researcher? How do I manage these different identities? And then I was asked if I would work in the government, and I took 5 years stepping out of higher education. And again, a change of identity, because I felt as a researcher I was able to contribute to policy in teacher education when I was sitting in higher education. However, it was only when I stepped into the government I realised that actually our view of policy when you're sitting outside it is very different to when you're sitting inside the policy community. So again, while I had responsibility for looking at teacher education across the whole of the country and facilitating their professional development, I never lost the research and the sense of being a teacher educator, even though I was responsible for commissioning research in higher education at that point. And lastly, here I am now, again, changed back into the university. I have to say, after 5 years going back into higher education was a culture shock. The change in higher education in those 5 years was quite dramatic in terms of technology. And I'm now Professor of Educational Research at Policy and Practice in the University of Glasgow. And what's interesting about the University of Glasgow is that it was founded in 1451. So it's what we call an ancient university, and it is very proud of its traditions, its history, and for the very well-known, world-renowned scholars, not least Adam Smith, the moral philosopher and economist, who was one of the most widely read and influential thinkers of the 18th century. We have a statue of him at the bottom of our Senate building, and everybody, you know, rubs his foot. He's such an important figure for us. And his influence in terms of moral and economic thinking is still felt today. And it's that kind of influence that we are being urged to continue, that sense of tradition. And I would be surprised if anyone in this audience disagreed that higher education and teacher education today are situated in changing contexts. And this conference gives us time just to perhaps step back from our busy days and just reflect on what are these changes doing in terms of transitions to different identities for each one of us. And I'm going to argue in this presentation that I think we should be proactive in transformational change. Sometimes I think we're caught in the winds of change and we feel that things are being done to us. And I think in higher education we have a responsibility to be proactive. For me, teacher education has always been at the forefront of change. I firmly believe that teacher educators have important responsibilities supporting and challenging the development of teachers for the future. And we should be pushing the boundaries of what we know about learning and teaching and about the conditions for effective learning environments. I believe that education, whether you're a school of education or a faculty of education, has a huge contribution to make to the universities in terms of learning and teaching. I was really heartened to hear that the university here have opened a learning and teaching centre around pedagogical use. And I think that we have a lot to contribute to the university as a whole, because our research and our life is in understanding learning processes and understanding methodology and pedagogical approaches. And I think that it is a great opportunity for us within higher education. I think the nature of the changes and the values that underpin the context of those changes and the implications for teacher education and teacher educators are much more contested. Again, we heard from our young presenters the sense that some of the traditionalists perhaps don't feel entirely comfortable with the changes. And I think what happens is that values and beliefs that are not in alignment with the proposed changes can block the transitions in professional learning. And I would like us just to think more deeply about those transitions. So 5 years on from the founding of our university, the ambitions remain to be recognised as world-class, world-changing university demonstrating excellence in research, in teaching, and having a global reach and impact. Again, really reiterating the words that we heard from the rector there. The sense that we have to balance our responsibilities, to be a teacher, yes, but the expectations for research and the expectations that your research and your teaching will have an impact. Hence, I see the rise in the number of papers from Turkey in terms of making your mark in the international literature. So how do we balance these different roles? And in thinking about transitions in higher education and about the changing context, the impact on universities, I would like to share two quite different perspectives with you. The one on your left-hand side, The Idea of the University, is a book that was published in 1852, John Henry Newman's view, and the one on your right-hand side, Understanding the University, was published in 2016, just this year, and it is part of a trilogy of books by Ron Barnett, and he has been looking and trying to understand the changes and the possibilities for universities. But I'd like to start with John Henry Newman, and I want just to read you his words in terms of his view about what a university should be doing. And he said back in 1852, "If I were asked to describe as briefly and as popularly as I could what a university was, I would draw my answer from its ancient designation of a school of universal learning. This description implies the assemblage of strangers from all parts in one spot. How will you find professors and students from every department of knowledge if they are not brought together in one spot? Accordingly, in its simple and rudimentary form, it is a school of knowledge of every kind, consisting of teachers and learners from every quarter. Many things are requisite to complete and satisfy the idea embodied in this description, but the university seems to be, in its essence, a place for communication and circulation of thought by means of personal intercourse through a wide extent of the country. His view had a particular emphasis on learning for learning's sake and the sense of it being a place where we could communicate and interact with one another as well as passing on to others. And so what has that legacy left for us? Well, 164 years later, Ron Barnett begins his book by asking the question, just what is it to understand the university? In his view, we are less clear about the purpose of a university today. I think that the key message is, again, these many forces acting upon us in our role. He argues, unless we are clear about what it is to understand a university, we are liable to fall short in our hopes and expectations of the university. And in turn, our university practices and our projects are liable to fall short of their possibilities. We might harbour undue expectations of the university, or we might have few or no hopes of what the university being other than it is. And he's very, very strong on imagining what the future could be and being proactive in making that happen. He suggests that whether we look back to the ancient traditions of John Henry Newman or to more contemporary ideas, the university has become a global phenomenon, in that accompanying the university is an increasingly global set of promptings, challenges, and hopes. Much, he says, is expected of the university as a means of transforming society. What a responsibility we have to transform society. And he suggests that the empirical evidence for such influence is somewhat thin. However, he says the university is caught up in massive forces of economic, social, and technological change, and it's contributing to some of those changes, but it can hardly catch its breath to come up with a satisfactory understanding of itself. Without such an understanding of it, the university is liable to be overly subject to these large forces acting on it and will lack the deep insight into the possibilities before it. So I would like to add, turning to teacher education within higher education, that we have not properly considered the implications of its higher education status. That first shift that I made from a college of education in the 1990s into the university, teacher education has not properly considered the possibilities of contributing to educational change within higher education. Let's make the most of that higher education status. So, to outline what I'm going to try and talk about in the time that I have with you, the changing context of higher education and teacher education, looking at teacher education transitions and transformational learning. In the third part, I'd like to look at a potential analytical framework to support critical reflection on transitions. I'm offering one. There are other analytical frames I could have chosen, but I've selected one. And finally, just to really reflect on ourselves as learners, to recognize our identity as, in the one hand, knowledgeable experts, but on the other, when we talk about use of technology and different methodologies and so on, we have to accept our identity as learners. In any attempt to understand teacher education today and the implications for teacher educators' professional learning, I argue that within teacher education, we are facing three different sets of challenges. There are contexts within higher education we have to understand in terms of expectations of students, technology and so on, and I'll come to that in a minute. We also have to understand the changing context for teacher education in terms of what we're asked to do around regulations for what is accepted as being a teacher in schools these days, and also the context in schools is radically different from even 5-10 years ago. And what that leads to is a sense of rivaling roles and a dialectic state in terms of so many movements working in contest with one another. And we need to reflect on what does this mean for us as teacher educators in terms of our own learning. Are we researchers? Are we teachers? Are we both? And how do we take account of the changes in school? Because we are preparing teachers to work in those schools. According to Ron Barnett in one of his other books, Rethinking the University, which was published last year, he says a complex world is one in which we are assailed by more facts, data, evidence, and arguments that we can hardly handle within the frameworks that we have. So again, going back to our young hosts at the beginning, their argument that some of us are stuck in a frame that doesn't belong to where we are positioned now. And what he says is, by contrast, a super complex world is one in which the very frameworks that we orientate ourselves to the world are themselves contested. So if you go back to my previous slide, where you see, as teacher educators, we're caught in this world of higher education, of regulations for teacher education and for those qualifying as teachers, and in terms of the context of school that we're preparing our teachers for. How do we make sense of these sometimes very competing roles? Super complexity. So we heard some of the challenges in higher education that we have to deal with. Undoubtedly, the university sector in terms of economic, social and technological change. We have seen a huge growth in our student population, and also we are constantly competing for students and for funding. We have the diversity of our students. There's great pressure on us around equitable access, which means in terms of learning capabilities, we have a much wider range in higher education. Our students come with very different expectations, where they are paying large fees. They see themselves as clients of the university, and even to the extent that some of them have an expectation, they've paid for a degree and they will not fail. And how we manage that within the higher education sector. And at the same time, moving away from John Henry Newman's notion that universities were about knowledge for knowledge's sake, the expectation of we should fit what's required in the labour market in terms of our expectations. So these new patterns in terms of what we do are quite different for us within higher education. Our students look like this. I don't know if your students look like this, but our students look like this. So in terms of technology and access to knowledge, what we do within the university has to give them something different. It's a very trite expression that you hear time and time today about what is our value add. But when they have access to knowledge at their fingertips, to what extent do we within the university give them something that they see is important, and we can add to it. So again, in terms of our teacher education programmes, and in many ways this is what I was asked to do in terms of Scottish Teachers for a New Era, to step back and say, how do we do teacher education differently? We have to think about new ways of understanding knowledge and how we learn. The new and powerful technologies, those of you who are perhaps involved in the massive open online courses, MOOCs, we've had to learn a whole new language, we've had to learn a whole new way of looking at learning. It isn't a question of taking what we used to do and simply putting it online. We have to actually transition into something quite different. And for those of you who are not au fait with what a SPOC is, because it only came into my language relatively recently, it is quite different from a MOOC, massive open online. A SPOC is a small, private online course. So instead of these large courses that are open to all, the SPOCs enable us to deliver short courses for fewer credits that are private and that are enclosed to a certain community of scholars. And it is a stepping stone that we have been looking into on our way to MOOCs. But that whole language has caused great transitions for many of our expert professors who saw themselves with great wisdom to pass on to their students, being completely decentralized in terms of their thinking, because actually to ask them to shift into thinking of MOOCs or SPOCs was a real change to their identity of who they were. And having to enter that world where they are a total novice created certain difficulties. And we carry on in terms of new patterns of partnership. In Scotland, we have kept our role very strongly of higher education and teacher education together, whereas perhaps if you're aware in England, it's quite different. But we have still had to have new partnerships. Our new migration flows means that the student diversity in terms of languages, both within the university and in schools, is different. We have new standards for teachers that we have to really stay firmly to. And now there is an increasing number of countries around the world where there are standards for teacher educators. And again, we sit within the regulations of higher education, and yet, in order to be teacher educators, we have a set of standards that are more linked to schools and the requirements of teacher education there. So again, quite a difference. When we look at schools, because our job as teacher educators is to prepare our teachers to go out into schools, the European Commission had published a report on schools for the 21st century, and none of this is new. I'm sure every single one of us has seen this kind of thing before, but the whole point about standing back and thinking, well, what should schools look like? And in teacher education, we should have a role in thinking through what is important. What are the significant aspects of learning for our students, and how do we go about teaching them? It's very interesting, though, that the documents at European Commission level, at UNESCO level, many of the key policy documents talk about what we have to do. There is far less on how we as teacher educators should change what we do. So on the one hand, there's an urgency for new curricular knowledge. We're told that we need new pedagogical and assessment approaches, and we see the list of new skills. Everybody here will be very familiar with these lists, but the question for us is just how do we change our teaching within higher education and within teacher education to meet these skills. And so it leads me to 3 challenging questions. Do we have dynamic, reflexive teacher education programs? Are we in that sense of interaction and communication, not only with our students, but with schools and with those that are making the standards for teacher educators? Do the teachers we work with recognise themselves as learners? Do they see higher education as the beginning of their journey of being a teacher? And that when we send them out to schools, they are beginning that learning process in terms of understanding throughout their whole career that they must add to what they know and what they do. And a very personal question for all of us: do we in this room recognise ourselves as learners, and do we take responsibility in terms of our own learning process? And this very much brings me into understanding professional learning, professional development, not only from an epistemological point of view, what is it we need to know as learners, but also from an ontological perspective, in really changing our own sense of being. It takes me into talking about transitions for teacher educators' professional learning, and it puts us into that very unclear conceptual ground with the potential for misunderstanding, for different interpretations. What is meant by a transition? What's meant by teacher educators? What's meant by professional learning? All of these we could debate at length, individually and collectively. There is an underlying assumption that transition and professional development means progress and transformation to something different and better. This leads us into another set of questions. What do we understand by effective learning? What do we understand by effective teaching? And into theories of change and transformation in order to understand transitions and in order to understand professional learning. I can't deal with all these conceptual challenges in this presentation, but I'm going to offer some perspectives on the meaning of transitions. Seeking clarification of meaning is an important step in teacher education for transitions. What one concept means to one person may not be the same for another. And when we are sitting in those three different worlds, what is understood as a transition in higher education, what's understood as a transition in teacher education, and what's understood as a transition in schools may well be quite different. Could be the same, but it could be different. So that clarification of meaning, that struggle to understand, becomes a key part of our own professional learning and our development as teacher educators. We don't all experience the changes in the same combination at the same time. I identified some of the changes that you might be facing, but my list was not exhaustive. I am sure you could add. My focus is understanding the challenge of transitions for professional development for us as teacher educators. But what do we understand as transitions? And I have picked just two definitions here in terms of the process of changing from one state to another, a passing or a passage from one condition, action, or place to another. For me, these definitions don't capture the essence of transformational learning. We have to add that sense of something new and something different. And my main message is the importance of understanding teacher educators as learners, understanding ourselves as adult learners in the context of transitions, and understanding that we have different reactions to change. As individuals, we have our own learning needs. In order to provide more specific, relevant, timely, and effective professional development, we need to have a better understanding of these individual needs. Just as our students have individual learning needs, teachers have individual professional learning needs. Our expectation is that our teachers will go out into school and understand their pupils as individuals. If you're a head teacher in a school and you turn to your teacher and say, "Tell me about how so-and-so is getting on," if a parent says, "How is my child getting on?" the expectation is our teachers will understand them as individual learners. Do we understand our students as individual learners? They come into higher education with very different experiences. Do we understand what they bring? Do we build from their learning? And do we understand their journey as a learner? Do we understand ourselves as individual learners? You would not like me to think of each one of you in this room as bringing the same experience to what you're hearing today. Each one of you is different. Each one of you has different experience. Each one of you starts on that learning journey as a teacher educator in a different place. And so generalised professional learning opportunities are helpful and informative for some things, but for fundamental, deep changes of the nature that we've been talking about this morning, when we're asking people to change their identity, to change their beliefs about how people learn, to change their beliefs about how they teach in a university, or how they deal with these forces of change round about them, calls for a type of professional learning that starts to really identify what are the challenges for the individual, and how does the individual feel when they're moving forward in their work. So as individual teacher educators, we have our own biography and experiences, beliefs and values that are personal to us. Mesereau suggests that our own history influences the way we see ourselves, our relationships, and the way we pattern our lives. He refers to this as our personal paradigm, as meaning perspectives, how we make sense of these changes. And he suggests that we must learn to be critically aware of the cultural and psychological assumptions that influence what we see. Some things will be blocked from our vision because we believe deep down in certain ways of doing things. He argues there are certain challenges that cannot be resolved by simply learning more about them or learning how to cope with them effectively. In the circumstances, familiar assumptions have to be challenged for new directions to be taken. For some people, facing these challenges or transitions is difficult, even threatening, while others appear to accept change without any problem at all. In fact, they welcome change and they are enthusiastic. According to Mesereau, transformational learning is a process of effecting change to our own frames of reference. And remembering back to what Ron Barnett was saying about our frames of reference being lost and disappearing because of the super complexity that we live in, what Mesereau is saying, how do we affect change in our frames of reference, which he suggested are structures of assumptions that we have about how people learn and how we understand our experiences. They shape and at the same time limit what we see and how we can change. They limit our expectations, our perceptions, our cognitions, and our feelings. They set our line of action. I want to give you now a very practical example of individual teachers' response to change. Along with colleagues in the University of Glasgow, I was asked to undertake a piece of research that looked at the impact of a new curriculum. We have a new curriculum in our Scottish schools, and it was first of all put out in draft form. And the government wanted to know the reaction of teachers to the change. And so we collected evidence from teachers right across the country. And perhaps unsurprisingly, there was quite different reactions to change. So that on the one hand, again on your left-hand side, we had teachers who were afraid of the new curriculum. We had teachers who said because it was asking for more active learning methodology that they felt their sense of loss of identity. They said that they really needed much more structure to follow. They were uncomfortable with feelings of loss of control of learners, getting them to work in groups, having more of a voice from the pupils. And then on the other side of the continuum, to your right, we had teachers who embraced the new identity. We had teachers who really understood that teaching was about inquiry, and they were willing to work in this new way, and everything in between. Now, it hardly surprises us to look at this map, and yet, if we then lay on the map of what happened in terms of professional learning, because the type of professional learning the teachers received in order to understand and make meaning of the new curriculum was a one-size-fits-all professional learning. So here are where the teachers were in terms of their feelings about change and transitions, but in actual fact what was organised was events like this, where it was one message about here is the curriculum, here is what to do. And the opportunities to understand that the teachers were in very different places wasn't there in these large events. I continued my research, this time working with teacher educators, and we collected evidence to understand the implications of these curriculum changes for teacher educators. And again, you won't be surprised to hear that the teacher educators were saying, well, there are different factors influencing whether we can embrace the new curriculum. The STEM, the science and technology curriculum, was quite different, and it was a challenge for those teacher educators working in that field. Those that were working in history, social sciences subjects, they found it challenging because the new curriculum had moved on to a very thematic approach, looking at themes, people in place, for example, right across the curriculum. Those that were working in languages felt a little more comfortable because they'd already been moving into the communication part of languages. And so there were very different starting points when it came to the curriculum. And within the schools and the local authorities, there were different mechanisms for support. So some set up groups to enable the teachers to really talk about where they were at in terms of their own subject. And again, what this really showed very clearly is transitions in terms of professional learning need a much more differentiated approach. And what it showed was the sense of multiple transitions for some. Some had to really think hard about that science, technology, math side of the curriculum, and others it was easier. And for some, the time taken in transition was much longer. For some, it was shorter. So the period of understanding a change process within higher education or teacher education, for some that change process takes 1 year. For some it's 2 years, for some it's 3 years. And we are now some 10 years on from when the first draft curriculum was put out, and only now some are feeling comfortable. So the impact on their identity as a teacher or as a teacher educator was quite significant for some. And also the distinctions between system and organisational change. So the structural change came first. The transition to the new curriculum came first. The thought about assessment came next. The time lag was then, what are we going to do about professional learning for the teachers and the teacher educators came last. The message is that in terms of thinking about change, it's like the cogs and wheels inside your watch. We have to think about that change process as a whole mechanism. To try and change one of those cogs without thinking about the other. Again, if you use the analogy of the watch would stop if all the cogs weren't working together. And so not thinking about the professional development and the professional learning of teacher educators and teachers means that we are liable to have this time lag in the change process. The other thing is that some transitions are obvious. So changing the curriculum, very obvious. For others, what goes on behind the transition is much more hidden. So not all teacher educators were willing to divulge the struggle for meaning they were having of these new change forces. They kept it hidden, much more difficult to deal with. And for others, it was combinations of obvious and hidden transitions. So moving to a conceptual framework to help us to think about these transitions, I want to draw on the work of Mayer and Land, who talk about threshold concepts, which they see as a potential to help us to uncover some of the challenges teacher educators face in their personal theories of learning and teaching, and also in terms of being able to understand the transitions that they're going through. And they call these threshold concepts a portal, opening up a new and previously inaccessible way of thinking about something. It represents a transformed way of understanding or interpreting or viewing something without which the learner cannot progress. So in other words, we get to a threshold concept. If we can't find our way through it, then we're blocked from that change. We stay stuck in that traditional way of working. We can't find our way to the other side in terms of thinking about learning and teaching in a different way. What constitutes a threshold concept may well differ from individual to individual, although not necessarily. But in order to consider teacher education for transitions and for transformation in practice, we need to understand more about the challenges of transitions for individuals. And Mayer and Land identified the sets of characteristics of threshold concepts. It had to be transformative. You couldn't just accept a new curriculum or accept ways of working without really making that transformation in your attitudes and in your beliefs and in your values. They said that it's unlikely to be forgotten, so once you get it, you really get it. It's not a superficial change. It's not, yes, I'll give lip service to these new methodologies. Yes, I'll use technology, but actually, I really still want face-to-face with my students. I'll put in an hour or two of technology-blended learning, but I still really believe the best learning goes on through face-to-face. So they haven't quite got their way through that threshold concept. So once you're through it and really understand the change, they suggest it's unlikely to be forgotten. They see it as integrative, where relationships change, where people begin to see how effective new ways of working can be. They feel it has boundaries that you can identify, but they are interlinked, and often they are troublesome. And the key to making that transition is uncovering and actually surfacing what is troublesome for the individual. What is it that stops us going through that threshold? To answer the question of why we have variation, why is it in that map I showed you we had some people on the right-hand side perfectly at ease with change and others who are not? Why do we get that variation? And to answer that question in terms of transitions for professional development of teachers, it's really necessary to understand what is causing the resistant difficulties and blocking the transformation. So the key message is that teacher educators are not a homogeneous group. We are not a homogeneous group. Every teacher educator, every one of you, is different. Uncovering what each teacher educator brings to their professional learning and what challenges they have in implementing new content or learning and teaching approaches is necessary in order to facilitate them in developing their learning according to their own students' needs. What may appear in one extent to being troublesome for one in terms of knowledge will not be for another. In some cases, teacher educators may appear to accept new knowledge or ideas, but their underlying beliefs and interpretations resurface under pressure. So in order to complete a syllabus or to prepare students for high-stake exams, they fall back to traditional means of learning and teaching. What appears as counterintuitive in new knowledge or is overriding may then happen that our tacit knowledge resurfaces. As Mayer and Land suggest, their troublesomeness has significant pedagogical importance. So those of us that are caught, it then has real pedagogical importance. How can transitions in teacher education's professional learning be supported and challenged? For transformational learning, what we have to do is to reanalyze and reflect, rework prior knowledge, abandon previous knowledge and views, and differentiate. This is not easy. I want to now turn to some of the aspects that we actually did in practice, lest you think I am working and talking about a utopian world. So the European Commission, in a document that they published, said that we should have greater access to peer mentoring and guidance within higher education. Certainly peer mentoring is something that we've brought into the university in Glasgow. All our new members of staff have a probationary period, just like teachers. They have a mentor for their first 3 years. They have that individual guidance around their professional learning. And engagement in regular discussion of professional learning needs. Lots of professional learning is set up in our university. The least amount of time is actually spent in these kinds of mentoring conversations. We have a publication in Scotland at the moment for our school teachers, and it actually asks them, you may have heard of it, the How Good Is Our School programme. It's being translated in many languages around the world, but the newest document was published last year, and it asked our teachers to do 3 things: to look inwards, knowing ourselves inside out through effective self-evaluation. So as teacher educators, I think a good message to engage in self-evaluation. What is causing the blockage in that transformation? It asks us to look outwards in terms of learning from others and what they're doing around the world. And it asks us to look forwards, exploring what the future might hold for today's learners and planning how we get there. I think that these are good suggestions for us. So, to turn to how we actually made that change, I'd like to go back to Scottish Teachers for a New Era. I was asked to lead a programme that stepped back and said, what should teachers be able to do and know about and care about in the 21st century? And we had to rewrite the whole programme from scratch. We started with a blank sheet of paper. Normally what we'd done over the years, and we've had many reviews of teacher education since I started teacher education in 1980, each time we were tinkering around the edges, changing little bits of our courses. What we did was we started with a blank sheet of paper. Everybody was involved in the change process. We implemented it and we researched it as we went along. It involved every single member in the School of Education in a transformation process. We shared their aim of the programme for teacher education, and we looked at the reactions that everybody had to these transitions. We learned a lot about troublesome transitions, and we gained a better understanding. If I had to start again, I would have a view of how we might go about it. And key to those individual transitions for our teacher educators were these key things. Building the trusting relationships. We took a long time to gain the respect of colleagues who felt we had a very good teacher education programme before. Why change? But if we look at the forces that are round about us, it is a bigger risk not to change. How many of us would go to a doctor or a dentist who still said, well, 20, 30 years ago, I had a good practice. Why should I change? Within teacher education, it is a bigger risk not to change. Go back to the picture of our students with their mobile phones. We are working in a different world. So there was a lot of emotion. There was a lot of fear, there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of joy. We had to reduce the hierarchies in bringing together the staff in the School of Education. So it wasn't a case of someone above them saying, here is what we're doing, can you comment? It was a real negotiation of a new way of working and a new way of being. We had to establish operating norms so you could reduce the hierarchy. We had to have that constant dialogue and clarification of meaning. Someone would talk about change with technology and someone else would suggest what it might be. Someone else would have a different definition of what that change would be. Constantly seeking clarification of meaning, constantly challenging assumptions, and continually working at a shared sense of purpose. Going back to Ron Barnett's question, what is a university? What does it stand for? Getting that sense of shared purpose of what we were doing. Some of the staff in the School of Education likened it to rewiring a house with the electricity switched on. We could not tell our students to stay away from the university for 4 years while we change our courses. We were changing our courses, and at the same time we were teaching our students on the old course. So we had a blank sheet of paper to rewrite our courses, but at the same time we were teaching the courses that were already there. And so the complexity of what we were doing wasn't lost. It needed a lot of nudging and a lot of patience, but most of all, it needed us to understand that transitions in the professional learning of our teacher educators were different for every single one of them. And that sense of peer mentoring and the discussion groups among colleagues was fundamental. But it did result in transformational change. Embedding it is a different matter, because that still is ongoing. Thank you very much.